In hay fever, the superior salivatory nucleus gives a branch called as sensory root of facial nerve, which is also called as nervus intermedius. It should actually be called as parasympathosensory root because nervus intermedius carries parasympathetic fibers and special sensory fibers. Geniculate ganglia, this is where the ganglion of sensory part of facial nerve. From the ganglion is a parasympathetic fiber which is called as greater petrosal nerve. This is also called as greater superficial petrosal nerve because there is a lesser superficial petrosal nerve which is a branch of glossopharyngeal, and there is a deep petrosal nerve which is from the sympathetic fibers around the internal carotid artery. The greater petrosal nerve joins with the deep petrosal nerve at the foramen lacerum. In the anterior wall of foramen lacerum, both the parasympathetic greater petrosal and the sympathetic deep petrosal pass through the pterygoid canal, the anterior wall of foramen lacerum. It is called as nerve of pterygoid canal. The parasympathetic fibers release in the pterygopalatine ganglion. From the pterygopalatine ganglion, there are multiple branches. One of them is a zygomatic branch of maxillary, which gives zygomatic-temporal lacrimal, supplies the lacrimal gland. But from the pterygopalatine ganglion are also given of nasopharyngeal branches, nasal branches, and palatine branches. So, pterygopalatine ganglion supplies 4 glands: lacrimal gland, glands of the pharyngeal mucosa, branches of the nasal mucosa, and mucosa of palate. So, when there is irritation of this pathway, you will get lacrimal secretion from the eye, you will get a nasopharyngeal drip, running nose, and palatine mucosal excess secretion. Typically, this happens in the allergic condition, which is called as hay fever. That's why the pterygopalatine ganglion is called as a ganglion of hay fever. Palpation of submandibular gland. Submandibular gland has got 2 parts. A part which is superficial to mylohyoid muscle, and a part which is deep to mylohyoid muscle. So it's a J-shaped structure. The superficial part can be palpated from the external aspect. The deep part can be palpated by inserting a finger on the sides of the tongue in the floor of the mouth, where you can feel the deep part. That's an oral structure. Remember, mylohyoid is the orocervical diaphragm. So deeper to mylohyoid is the oral structure. Superficial to mylohyoid is a superficial part of it. If you want to feel the entire gland, one finger is to be inserted on the side of the tongue in the floor of the mouth, and the other finger is in the neck. So submandibular salivary gland is palpated by a bidigital examination. One finger in the floor of the mouth, one finger in the neck. When you use the word submandibular gland, suppose you are feeling the superficial part, you are not very sure whether it is the submandibular salivary gland or submandibular group of lymph nodes. So when you use the word submandibular gland, remember, gland is called as eden in Greek. So when you say adenitis, it means inflammation of the gland. And when you say lymphadenitis, it means inflammation of lymph. So to be very clear, whether you are talking about submandibular lymph node, lymph gland, or whether you are talking about submandibular salivary gland, you must, the question mark here signifies to specify salivary gland or lymph gland. Of course, If you can feel the structure bidigitally, it has to be some particular salivary gland only, because there is no lymph node in the oral cavity. Lymphadenitis can be palpated only externally. It can't be felt internally. In the nasal cavity, in the nasal septum, there are multiple branches. 4 to 5 branches meet here in the junction of anterosuperior and posterior. So there is an oblique line which divides the septum into anterosuperior, posterior. And more towards the anterior part, there is a multiple blood vessels compared, anterior ethmoidal branches of ophthalmic. Posterior ethmoidal directly does not reach that. Posterior ethmoidal anastomoses with other branches, and through that it reaches this thing. From the sphenopalatine foramen is the sphenopalatine artery, which is the branch of maxillary artery from tegumental fossa. It also reaches this particular point from the maxillary artery itself, running down is greater palatine artery. Then it runs horizontally in the oral cavity, and through the incisive foramen, it comes into the nasal cavity. And of course, superior labial branch of visceral artery, which supplies the upper lip. It reaches the midline, it enters the nasal cavity. And all 4 to 5 branches anastomose in this area. This area was described by a scientist called Little. So it is called as Little's area, but the plexus of vessels which are lying here was described by Kieselbach's. The plexus of vessels here is called as Kieselbach's plexus, and this is a site where nasal bleeds commonly occur. So if the nasal bleed is called as epistaxis. When epistaxis occurs, you have to pinch the nose constantly for 5 minutes to stop the bleeding and formation of clot. We described this earlier also, but let us revise this. The frontal air sinus are 2 sinuses just above and medial to the orbital margin. The green colored ethmoidal air cells, multiple air cells, are medial to the orbit. Maxillary air sinus forms the floor of the orbit, forms the roof of the oral cavity, and forms the lateral wall of the nose. That's a large sinus, maxillary air sinus. And what you can't see in this field is the depth, is the sphenoidal air sinus. The maxillary air sinus opens into the middle meatus of the nose, which is in the upper part of the maxillary sinus. The ethmoidal sinus opens in the middle and superior meatus, again in the upper part of the ethmoidal air sinus. Sphenoidal air sinus also has got its opening in the upper part. Only frontal air sinus has its opening in the lower part of the frontal air sinus. If there is sinusitis, it causes accumulation of infective fluid within the sinus, except frontal sinus. So after you treat the sinuses with the antibiotics, etc., the infective fluid continues to remain in the sinus. After the antibiotic is stopped, the sinuses inflame again because the infective fluid bacteria will be there in the sinuses. So that's why sinusitis is a very recurrent problem because of accumulation of fluid within it. Peculiarly, obviously, the frontal air sinus, because its opening is at lower end, infective fluid will not accumulate the frontal sinus. Therefore, recurrent frontal sinusitis does not occur. All the other sinuses have a recurrent sinusitis problem. The question asked is, why is it that the sinuses have their opening in the upper end instead of like the frontal sinus is at the lower end? So the infective fluid will never accumulate. The reason is the sinuses act as extra respiratory mucosal area so that when air enters the nose, it also enters the sinuses. Within the sinuses, because of the additional surface area, the air gets warm. So the cold air which you are inhaling, especially in the colder climates, gets warmed in the sinuses. This warm air rises to opening of the uh, sinuses has to be at its upper end so that the warm air will rise and go back to the respiratory tract. So that explains why the sinuses have their opening at its upper end because of this functional breathing. If the question asks, why is the frontal sinus having its opening at its lower end? Because the warm air enters the frontal sinus, it will remain in the upper part of the frontal sinus because warm air rises. It will not come back in. The reason for this is that the head is not the most cranial part in a quadruped. So in a quadruped, if you look at the dog, say for example, it has got nose at its tip, mouth and nose at its tip of the head. So what happens is when the air is inhaled, it enters all the sinuses and all the sinuses open upwards into the nose. So warm air will rise up and go. In humans, because the adoption of biped posture, the head instead of facing upwards is now facing forward, automatically making the frontal air sinus ineffective for acting as the air conditioning effect of the nose. The other sinuses still continue to do so. But luckily, we also have the reason that frontal sinusitis is not a recurrent problem. Sinuses being a part of the mucosa of the uh, respiratory tract can undergo cancerous stage, out of which maxillary sinus is the most common one, which results in spread of cancer spread. If the cancer is limited to the maxillary sinus, there is no problem. But once it starts growing, it will break through the floor of the orbit and the eyeball will be displaced. So you'll have two eyeballs. One eyeball is displaced, the other eyeball is where its own place. What happens is, luckily, in cases of external pressure, the eyeball's axis not being parallel to each other, the brain will block the images coming from the affected eye and allow images from only the normal eye to be perceived. This does not happen when it is a paralysis of the extraocular muscles. Paralysis of the extraocular muscles, even if the two visual axes are not parallel to each other, both the images are perceived, and then you get diplopia. Whereas in the growing maxillary sinus, which causes displacement of the eyeball from its place, that will suppress the image from that eye, so there is usually no diplopia. Such a type of non-paralysis of eyeball is called as strabismus or squint. This is called as concomitant squint, where even though visual axes are not parallel to each other, the angle by which they are displaced is fixed. Whereas when it comes to the other type of squint, which is called as parallateral squint, the axis between the two visual axes are not parallel to each other, but their angle keeps on changing depending on where you want to move the eye. If you want to move the eye towards a muscle which is paralyzed, the angle will increase. Whereas if you want to move the eyeball towards the affected side, in such a case, the visual axis nearly becomes parallel and the diplopia becomes lesser. So there are two types of strabismus: concomitant, where maxillary sinus growth has caused a fixed displacement of the two of one eyeball. If the maxillary sinus grows anteriorly, it will cause a swelling in the face. If it grows medially, it can block the nasal passage. If it grows inferiorly, it will perforate the palate and form an ulcer in the oral cavity. If it grows posteriorly, posterolaterally, it will affect the mandibular nerve in the infratemporal fossa. If it grows posteromedially, it will affect the maxillary nerve in the pterygopolyteal fossa. Either of these nerve irritation will cause severe pain over the area of distribution of that nerve. So maxillary nerve pain, neuralgic pain will be felt in the upper jaw. Mandibular nerve involved will feel neuralgic pain in the lower jaw. So maxillary sinus, repeat again. Growing tumor growing upwards will displace the eyeball. Growing medially will block the nose. Growing inferiorly cause an oral ulcer. Growing anteriorly cause a bulging in the face. Growing posterolaterally irritates mandibular nerve. Posteromedially irritates maxillary nerve. We have already discussed this, but let us discuss it again. This is a posterior view of the pharynx with a posterior wall cut. So in the upper part, what you are seeing is the choane, is the opening of each nasal passage entering into the nasal pharynx. In the nasal pharynx, there is a torus tubarius, which is the opening of eustachian tube. From the inferior part of the eustachian tube arises the salpingopharyngeal fold. Posterolaterally to the torus tubarius, is the pharyngeal recess of Rosenmuller. The pharyngeal recess of Rosenmuller is a very thin part of the supraconstrictor. When pierced, it will affect, damage the internal carotid artery, which lies immediately deep to pharyngeal recess. In the oral cavity, you can see the soft palate and the uvula, and below is the tongue. So the palatoglossus muscle, which acts as a oropharyngeal instrument, is the communication between the oral cavity and oropharynx. This is the opening of the larynx. What you can see here is the epiglottis, and in the larynx, aryepiglottic fold. There are corniculate and cuneiform cartilages. Erythroid is the posterior, corniculate cuneiform lies in the aryepiglottic fold. This is the laryngeal space on either side of the larynx and behind the larynx is called as laryngopharynx. What you can see in the laryngopharynx, just outside the opening of the larynx, aryepiglottic fold, is a depression which is called as pyriform fossa, or also called as smuggler's pouch. This area, the muscles generally are involuntary. Since they are striated, they can be trained. Diamond smugglers used to smuggle diamonds with the keeping them in the pyriform fossa, so that if the officer is asking him to open the mouth, he will not be able to see the diamond which are smuggled in the pyriform fossa. Pyriform fossa is where the internal laryngeal nerve enters the pharynx, and if the fish bone or fish thorn is stuck here and is badly removed without taking care, there are chances the internal laryngeal nerve will get damaged. And also, if there is cancer of the pyriform fossa, it usually goes undetected until it's quite late, because spread of cancer will occur to other parts includes and beyond also. So, three importance: smuggling diamonds, damage to the laryngeal, badly removing of fish thorn stuck there, or cancer which are detected quite late. Killian's dehiscence. We already discussed about structures which pass above the superior constrictor, auditory tube, and ascending qualitative branch of facial artery. Between the middle and inferior constrictor, a lot many superior middle constrictor, lot many structures pass through. Amongst them include xylopharyngeal, glossopharyngeal nerve, and xyloglossus muscle. Middle and inferior constrictor, you can see internal laryngeal nerve piercing the thyroid membrane and entering the piriform fossa. And below the inferior constrictor passes the recurrent laryngeal nerve and inferior laryngeal nerve. What you can see here is that there are two parts of inferior constrictor that arising from thyroid cartilage is called thyropharyngeus. That arising from cricoid cartilage is called cricopharyngeus. And there is a weakness between the thyropharyngeus and cricopharyngeus. The cricopharyngeus, like other constrictors, are supplied by pharyngeal plexus. The cricopharyngeus has got an additional branch from recurrent laryngeal nerve. Because of the additional branch from the different nerve, there are chances that the peristalsis wave will get affected because of the additional nerve supply to the pharynx. Normally, when the upper part of the pharynx contracts, the lower part goes into what is called as receptive relaxation. But when the thyropharyngeus goes into contraction, the cricopharyngeus may or may not go into receptive relaxation. Cricopharynx is a tough sphincter. If it fails to relax, what happens is thyropharyngeus and the lower part of the thyropharyngeus, which is a weakness, may bulge out. That is called as pharyngeal diverticulum. The weakness part where thyropharyngeus bulges out was described by a scientist called Killian. It is called as Killian's dehiscence. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 5 branches are shown to supply the palatine tonsils. One is a branch from the lingual artery. There are 2 branches from the facial artery. One is called as the main tonsillar branch, the main artery which supplies the tonsils, and there is a branch of facial artery called ascending palatine, which is also the same as the palatine, which is entering the pharynx through the gap above the superior constrictor. The ascending palatine on the way upward also gives a branch to the tonsils. The ascending pharyngeal artery branch to the branch. Maxillary artery is ascending palatine artery gives a branch. The tonsils. So 5 of these arteries supply the tonsils from the lateral side. All of them pierce the superior constrictor to enter the tonsillar bed. So when tonsillectomy is done, you can't go and ligate 5 vessels separate. What you're doing a guillotine amputation of the tonsil. The entire tonsil is plucked out from its bed, and then prevent these 5 arteries from bleeding. What you have to do is whatever the tonsil has to be removed en masse, and no clot is allowed to be formed there. So that no clots are there in the tonsil bed, the superior constrictor will go into full contraction and clamp all these 5 vessels at one go. So to control the tonsillar hemorrhage, you have to remove the clot from the tonsillar bed along with the tonsils, so that hemorrhage can be prevented. Main artery supplying the tonsil, of course, is a direct branch of facial artery. This is the tonsil artery. The soft palate has 5 muscles to pull it upwards, the levator palatine, and tensor bulleti, two bullet downwards, bulletoglossus and bulletopharyngeus, and one lying within the substance of the pharynx itself, as far as musculus uvulae. The larynx was in the nasopharynx in a newborn child. That's why we said the newborn child can swallow milk and breathe at the same time because there is no common oropharynx where food and air will go. And air from the nasopharynx will directly enter the nasal cavity nasopharynx, will directly enter the larynx, and the food will pass from oropharynx to nasopharynx. Oropharynx, laryngopharynx, nasopharynx. At that point of time, palaetoglossus and the paletopharyngeus were more or less horizontal. When the larynx descends down, the paletoglossal and paletopharyngeus both descend down. When they are descending downwards towards the paletopharyngeus, they are descending downwards. Few fibers of paletopharyngeus remains horizontal. This effectively seals, when it contracts, seals the oropharynx from nasopharynx. Along with the race of well, the seal is complete. So no food or milk can enter the nasopharyngeal space. In case of child with cleft palate, there are chances that the oral cavity milk will go into the nasal cavity, irritating the maxillary nerve. If the maxillary nerve is irritated in a child, the brain registers that some food has leaked from the oropharynx to the nasopharynx. So what it does is the horizontal fibers of paletopharyngeus and the soft palate are raised, trying to plug the gap between oropharynx and nasopharynx. That time, the horizontal fibers of paletopharyngeus is seen as a raising in the posterior pharyngeal wall, described by a scientist called Passavan, T silent. That is called as Passavan's ridge. This ridge is normally not seen in normal children, only children with cleft palate, because the strong contraction of this muscle causes a hypertrophy of the horizontal fibers of paletopharyngeus, which raises the ridge called Passavan's ridge. Hoarseness of voice, trichotomy, Siemens law. In case of irritation of anywhere in the laryngeal region, the vocal cords will go into spasm. The vocal cords are present here, lower part of the thyroid cartilage, at the vertebral level C5. The cricoid arch is present at vertebral level C6, and then starts the tracheal cartilages. The first cartilage, second cartilage, third cartilage, and fourth cartilage. Between the second, third, and fourth cartilage lies the isthmus of the thyroid gland. Any irritation on the laryngeal region causes the vocal cords to go into spasm. So the person cannot breathe. So in such a case, you have to do what is called as an emergency tracheostomy. Emergency tracheostomy can be done at 3 levels. Above the isthmus, at the first tracheal cartilage, it's a very small opening. Cutting the isthmus and behind the isthmus is a pretty safe surgery. Whereas try to go below the fourth tracheal cartilage and try to create an opening there. You are partly into the thorax and very superficial to the immediately deep to manubrium is a left brachiocephalic vein which crosses from the left side to the right side to join the superior vena cava, which is on the right of the midline. This brachiocephalic vein draining the upper limb and the head is crossing very superficial, immediately deep to the mandible, which may get damaged if you try to make a tracheostomy opening below the thyroid isthmus. So there is high tracheostomy, mid tracheostomy, and low tracheostomy. Low tracheostomy is dangerous because you will damage the left brachiocephalic vein. And high tracheostomy is too small opening. Therefore, ideally, what is that? Is a mid tracheostomy, cutting the thyroid isthmus and reflecting it to one side. An alternative to tracheostomy is what is called as cricotomy. Make an opening in the gap below the thyroid cartilage, above the cricoid cartilage. That opening is relatively avascular, is relatively large enough for a tube to be passed through. So that's called as cricotomy. And because it's at level below the vocal cords, usually there is no problem as far as alternative passage for air is concerned. One must remember that the cricothyroid, which is on either side, is usually not damaging the cricotomy. Cricothyroid is a muscle which causes tenseness on the vocal cord. If that cricothyroid muscle is paralyzed, either due to damage during the surgery or cricothyroid is supplied by the external laryngeal nerve, whereas all the remaining muscles of the larynx are supplied by recurrent laryngeal. So external laryngeal nerve, the only nerve which is supplying the muscle which causes tenseness to the external laryngeal nerve is damaged in thyroid surgeries. The vocal cords will not become tense, and that will cause hoarseness of voice. The other point to be remembered is that the rest of the recurrent laryngeal nerve is rest of the muscles are paralyzed, there is usually no hoarseness. If the abductors of the vocal cord are paralyzed, that results in vocal cords going into spasm and closing. You must do an emergency cricotomy or tracheostomy. But if the recurrent laryngeal nerve is damaged completely, abductors and reductors both go into paralysis. So usually there is no voice. What happens is one vocal cord, if one recurrent laryngeal nerve is damaged, the other vocal cord which is normal, they cross the midline to come close to the other recurrent laryngeal nerve so that some voice can be produced. But as the day progresses, the increasingly contracting adductors of the vocal cord crossing the vocal cord across the midline to meet the other paralyzed cord. At the end of the day, these muscles become fatigued and the person finds it difficult to speak and there is hoarseness of voice. So hoarseness of voice throughout the day will be paralysis of the thyroid muscle. Hoarseness of voice toward the end of the day is damage to one recurrent laryngeal nerve and the other muscle is fatigued and produces a voice which is low. Siemens' law states that recurrent laryngeal nerve, when they are partially damaged, the abductors of the vocal cord paralyze first and recover last. That is the Siemens law. In a partial damage to recurrent laryngeal nerve, the abductors of the vocal cord are the first to be paralyzed and the last to recover, which means the adductors are still functioning and you need to do a tracheostomy or a cricotomy. So that was what was described as Siemens. It implies that the recurrent laryngeal nerve branches to abductors are lying on the outer side of the nerve, the inner part of the nerve having fibers of adductors. So partial damage will affect the outer fibers. That is what causes paralysis of the irritation will cause spasm of the abdomen. Final slide. When describing the middle ear cavity, the middle ear can be considered as a matchbox. Here the lateral wall has been opened to show you the interior of the middle ear. Above the middle ear are the meninges and the temporal lobe of the cerebellum. Behind the middle ear is the mastoid antrum with its hair cells and also a large mastoid antrum and the opening of mastoid antrum. Sigmoid sinus is also like posterior to the middle ear. Inferior to the middle ear is the superior bulb of internal jugular vein. Antero-inferior is the carotid artery. The sympathetic plexus around it. Anteriorly, below is the opening of auditory tube. Above is the opening of tensor tympani muscle. In the middle, there is a large bulge. It's called as promontory. Remember, there is a bulge of the body of S1 vertebra, which is also called promontory. This area, which is the bulge, is also called promontory. This bulge is caused by the basal turn of cochlea. Cochlea has got 2.5 turns. Some people say 2.75 turns. The basal turn is where the water is produced, bulge into the area. Antero-superior to the bulb is the oval window where the footprint of sapes is antero-inferior to the promontory. Rather, postero-superior is the oval window and postero-inferior is the round window. This is closed by a secondary tympanic window. Posteriorly, you can also see below the mastoid antrum is the hollow, pyramidal hollow for stapedius muscle. Look at the course of the facial nerve. In the internal ear, facial nerve is traveling laterally, which is not shown in this picture. And in the middle ear, it first goes posteriorly. So there is a sharp bend from medial to lateral to anterior to posterior. Sharp bend is where the geniculate ganglion, the sensory ganglion of facial nerve is given off, and from the genital, that region, not from the ganglion, that region is a branch given off, which is called as greater petrosal. Greater petrosal nerve will enter the cranial cavity and leave the cranial cavity in the anterior wall of foramen lacerum called as pterygoid canal. The facial nerve then goes posteriorly and then there's a gradual turn for it to go in here. So one sharp bend at the geniculate ganglion, second gentle bend. So this is the S-shaped course of facial. In its vertical course, it comes out of the cranial cavity through the mastoid, stylomastoid foramen, and in its vertical course, it gives two branches. One branch to splenius muscle, the other branch which passes through the middle ear and exits the middle ear as a corda temporale. The tympanic branch of glossopharyngeal nerve enters the tympanic cavity to the floor of the middle ear. It forms a plexus on the promontory and gives a branch called as lesser petrosal nerve. Lesser petrosal nerve goes into the cranial cavity and comes out of the cranial cavity through the foramen vein. Other branches which enter the cranial cavity is a sympathetic plexus from the carotid artery. It is called as caroticotympanic branch. There are other branches which come to the anterior wall and posterior wall. Anterior tympanic, the branch of maxillum, and posteriorly other branches. That is the middle ear. Now, infection of the middle ear is called as otitis media. Infective fluid has come in from the auditory tube because respiratory tract infection are pretty much common. And in the auditory tube, it can enter the middle ear. The auditory tube is very oblique and narrow in adults. It is broad and relatively straighter in the child. The child head is small, the nasopharynx is relatively large, the ear is just behind the just posterolateral to the nasopharynx. So the auditory tube is wider and shorter in children. That's why respiratory infection in children quite often becomes otitis media. The infective fluid here can burst through any one of the 5 walls of the middle ear except the medial wall. The medial wall is a tough bone formed by the body labyrinth. It can break through the relatively thin wall superiorly and cause meningitis and temporal lobe abscess. It can invade posteriorly, affecting the sigmoid sinus, mastoiditis. It can affect inferiorly and affect the infection can go into the transjugular vein. It can infect anteroinferiorly, which will affect the carotid artery, and of course, what you can't see, the lateral wall is cut open. It can burst through the lateral wall of the middle ear. The lateral wall of the middle ear is formed by the eardrum, the tympanic membrane. So it can cause bursting of the tympanic membrane, and pus will come out of the external ear. These are the complications of otitis media. With that, we come to the end of the discussion. Do you have any questions?